November 28, 1942. Buna, Gunner-Track, Papua. Private Edward Ned Mallory, 2/14th Battalion, is sitting on a ration tin in the mud, boots steaming, socks stiff with salt. The jungle hums like a live wire. Mosquitoes. Distant Bren fire. A man somewhere vomiting quietly. Mallory doesn't reach for his rifle. He reaches for the thing on his belt. A bayonet, except the spine is toothed like a saw, and the steel looks wrong in the green light. He drags it across a branch to clear a firing slit. The teeth catch. They scream, a dry metal shriek that seems far too loud for a place where noise gets you killed. He tries again. Harder. The blade bites, then twists. And when it twists, it doesn't just snag timber. It shatters his plan, alerts the Japanese outpost, and forces a fight Mallory did not choose. Later, the army will investigate the weapon that failed him. Officially, it will leave almost no trace. And that absence is the story. Australia enters the Second World War as a nation tied to the imperial system. British patterns, British training manuals, British procurement habits. Then the Pacific detonates the illusion of distance. By early 1942, Australian infantry is fighting in conditions that punish every assumption made in European design offices. Humidity that swells wood, rot that eats leather, mud that turns precise mechanisms into gritty paste. The campaigns in Papua and later across New Guinea are not set-piece battles with long lines and predictable fields of fire. They are short-range engagements in green darkness, scrub, kunai grass, mangrove swamp, razor ridges. Cutting lanes, building weapon pits, hacking overhead cover. These tasks aren't side jobs. They are survival. And yet the Australian soldier's standard-edged implement remains a legacy concept. The bayonet as a thrusting weapon, fixed to a rifle, used for drill, intimidation, and the rare, brutal collision at contact distance. The tactical reality in the jungle is different. You are constantly clearing, prying, cutting, opening, digging. Your weapon must do work before it does violence. At the same time, Japanese forces are aggressive in infiltration and night action, with a culture of close combat that Australian units respect and fear in equal measure. That creates a uniquely Australian wartime pressure. A demand for tools that behave like weapons and weapons that behave like tools. So the question becomes simple. What do you put in a man's hand when the jungle is as dangerous as the enemy? Australia tries to answer it. And one answer, an experimental Mk7 bayonet concept that tried to combine knife and saw, will show exactly what happens when a clever idea meets unforgiving reality. The tactical problem is not romantic. It is mechanical. It is logistical. It is biological. A bayonet in the Pacific is exposed to rain, sweat, sap, fungus, sand, and constant impact. It gets driven into timber, used as a lever, employed as a stake, hammered through roots. The jungle turns edged weapon into improvised multi-tool, whether the ordnance department likes it or not. And the standard patterns weren't designed for that life. Here's the dilemma, laid out the way a quartermaster would see it, through failure modes. Comparative table format. British pattern 1907/1 bayonet family. Problem: long blade optimized for reach and drill, awkward as a bush tool. Scabbards and fittings suffer in wet tropics. Failure example: troops shorten blades in theater because carrying a sword-length bayonet in vine and scrub is misery. American M 1905/M1 bayonet family. Problem: built for a rifle doctrine and environments unlike New Guinea. Still not a dedicated jungle implement. Failure example: excellent steel doesn't solve the basic issue. The blade is not a saw, not a machete, and not a purpose-built field knife. Japanese Type 30 bayonet. Advantage: rugged simplicity, commonly used as a field knife. Japanese troops treat it as a working tool, not a parade accessory. Why it worked: the system matches their close combat mindset and daily field tasks. Australian need: a compact-edged tool that can cut and clear, survive prying and impact, still function as a bayonet attachment when doctrine demands it. So somebody in the Australian system has an idea that sounds almost logical on paper. Add a sawback to an existing bayonet concept. Turn the spine into teeth. Give the digger a tool for the jungle that still mounts on a rifle. But sawback blades carry baggage. Heavy baggage. In the First World War, sawback bayonets became propaganda objects, symbols of barbarity, accusations of unnecessary suffering, and the kind of story that spreads faster than a proper technical evaluation. Even decades later, the idea of a toothed bayonet is politically radioactive. So an Australian sawback bayonet is not just an engineering decision. It is a moral argument, a public relations risk, and a bureaucratic nightmare. And that's before you even test whether it works. The origin story of odd weapons is rarely a single genius in a workshop. It's usually a chain of frustrations, each link forged by a man who has to solve a problem now, not later. Picture the wartime Australian ordnance environment. Factories under pressure, patterns borrowed from Britain, local modifications made out of necessity. Bayonets are not glamorous. They're not aircraft. They're not artillery. But in the jungle, a bayonet can be the closest thing to a lifeline you have after your rifle. Australia already proves it can adapt bayonets to new weapons. By the mid-1940s, the Owen submachine gun, a brutally practical Australian design, has bayonet experiments circling it. The Australian War Memorial holds an experimental Owen submachine gun bayonet, recovered from a destruction consignment in the late 1950s. It has scrub green grips and a tubular backstrap meant to fit over the muzzle. This is the atmosphere: practical, improvised, and constantly trying to marry old concepts to new fighting. Australia also manufactures and shifts bayonet production domestically. World Bayonets notes that Lithgow began bayonet production in 1913, halted in 1927, then resumed in late 1940, with production moved to Small Arms Factory No. 3 at Orange in July 1942. That matters. It means Australia has not only the need, but the industrial pathway to prototype. So how do you get from standard bayonet to knife-saw hybrid? You don't begin with a clean sheet. You begin with what you can make quickly. You take a familiar profile. You add teeth. You argue it will help clear fields of fire, cut saplings, and save weight by eliminating the need for a separate saw. And then you run headfirst into a truth ordnance department's relearn every generation. A bayonet has to be three things at once: a blade, a mount, and a piece of equipment that survives abuse by exhausted men. When you change one part of that triangle, when you carve the spine into teeth, you change the balance, the heat treatment requirements, and the way the blade behaves under bending stress. The breakthrough moment, in most of these projects, isn't it cuts better. It's whether it doesn't break. And this one breaks the promise. Technical breakdown. Let's be clear up front. The experimental bayonet Mk7 in this episode is not a mass-issued standard item with clean production ledgers. That is the point. It sits in the shadowland between prototype and embarrassment. Exact specs varying by trial pattern, limited documentation, and a legacy kept alive more by surviving examples and collector research than by proud official histories. But we can anchor the technical discussion in what Australia did produce, how it produced it, and what an experimental sawback concept is trying to achieve. The baseline Australia knew. The pattern 1907/No. 1 family. World Bayonets provides a clear reference for the Australian-made pattern 1907 example. A 17.00-inch, 432mm, blade and 21.75-inch, 552mm, overall length, with a muzzle ring diameter around 0.660 inches, 16.6mm. That is sword bayonet territory. Long heavy enough. Awkward in tight vegetation. In Australian service, this is the doctrinal inheritance. The bayonet as a reach extender for the SMLE, a steel spear tip for a rifle line. The Australian pivot. Making bayonets fit new weapons. Now look at the Owen. World Bayonets describes the Owen MKI bayonet as effectively a newly manufactured pattern 1907 type bayonet but shortened. 10.00-inch, 254mm, blade, 14.875-inch, 378mm, overall length, muzzle ring diameter around 0.665 inches, 16.6mm. That's a decisive shift. Shorter, handier, closer to what a soldier might actually use as a knife. The Australian War Memorial's object entry for an Owen Mk1 bayonet and scabbard lists the maker as Small Arms Factory, Lithgow, with a 1953 manufacture date, and describes a single-edged blade, deeply fullered on both sides, fixed via muzzle ring and mortise slot with locking bolt. This tells us something important about Australian thinking. They're still using bayonets, still refining mounts, and still adapting old scabbard patterns. What a sawback Mk7 hybrid is trying to do. A sawback spine on a bayonet is an attempt to add a cutting function without issuing a separate saw. In theory, the teeth allow a soldier to cut green timber for overhead cover and firing slits, trim saplings for camouflage, create stakes and pickets for wire and shelters, modify positions quietly when chopping would be too loud. In practice, adding teeth introduces problems that are not obvious until you abuse the blade. Stress risers. Each tooth notch is a tiny crack starter. Under bending, those notches concentrate stress. Heat treatment complexity. A bayonet must balance hardness, edge retention, and toughness, resisting snapping. Saw teeth want hardness. Prying wants toughness. Those desires fight. Binding in green wood. Fresh timber is wet, fibrous, and sticky. Fine teeth clog. A bayonet lacks the tooth geometry and set of a real saw. Noise. Saws scream. In jungle night fighting, noise is danger. And then there's the ugly part. Sawback blades carry a reputation for producing ragged wounds. Whether the mythology is exaggerated or not, the perception matters. A weapon isn't just steel, it's politics. Manufacturing reality, where it would have been made. If Australia is trialling bayonet variants in this period, it's doing so through the same industrial ecosystem making standard items, Lithgow and Orange. World Bayonets explicitly states bayonet production at Lithgow resumed in late 1940 and shifted to SAF No. 3, Orange in July 1942 for most World War II output. Those are the natural candidates for prototype work. The experimental, disaster mechanics. So what goes wrong? A knife-saw hybrid bayonet fails when it tries to be two contradictory tools. A bayonet is thrust-driven and must resist lateral bending when it hits bone, webbing, or timber. A saw is draw-and-push-driven and must have tooth geometry designed for kerf clearance. Combine them poorly and you get a blade that cuts badly, snags often, bends unpredictably, and, most damning, risks structural failure at the toothed spine. In a field where men use bayonets as pry bars whether they're told to or not, that risk is not acceptable. That is why this story ends not with medals, but with silence. And that brings us to the human test. Now, if you're finding this interesting, consider subscribing. We're building something here for people who actually care about the details. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Here's the difficult truth. With many experimental weapons, combat effectiveness is a patchwork, rumor, fragmentary notes, scattered examples, and the absence of proud reporting. This bayonet didn't win a famous battle. It didn't become a national icon. If anything, its combat story is defined by what Australia chose not to keep. So we approach it the honest way, by reconstructing the environment it was intended for, comparing it to what Australia actually issued, and using surviving institutional evidence for the culture of bayonet experimentation. Vignette 1. The jungle demands a tool, not a symbol. In New Guinea, the enemy is often at spitting distance. Firefights happen at ranges where you smell cordite and damp earth. The bayonet has a psychological role. Steel at the end of a rifle is confidence. But the daily role is more mundane. Opening ration crates, cutting foliage, shaping concealment. A sawback bayonet promises to make that daily work easier. But as any engineer will tell you, a saw must clear a kerf. Without set teeth and proper geometry, green timber clogs. The blade binds. You pull harder. The weapon jerks. The hand slips. You don't need a Japanese bullet for that to become lethal. The knife-saw hybrid disaster isn't just failure to cut. It's failure under stress. Vignette 2. Australia's actual direction. Shorter, simpler, purpose-built. Australia's issued direction is visible in what survives in official collections. The Australian War Memorial's Owen Mk1 bayonet is not a saw. It's a compact knife bayonet with a robust mounting system and a shortened scabbard pattern that is a clue. Australia learned that what mattered was handiness and durability, not gimmick features. World Bayonets reinforces that the Owen bayonet program included a standard MKI and a MKI/I variant conversion from existing pattern 1907 blades. That's practical adaptation, exactly what you'd expect from a wartime force. A sawback bayonet is the opposite, a complex feature on a blade that is already asked to do too much. Vignette 3. The quiet evidence of disposal. The most telling combat-adjacent evidence is not a battle report. It's the fact that experimental pieces were later treated as scrap. The AWM entry for the experimental Owen submachine gun bayonet notes it was part of a consignment sent for destruction in the late 1950s and recovered by the donor. That's how you treat something the system does not want to support, catalog, or reissue. And that aligns with how knife-saw bayonet projects usually end. Too awkward to standardize, too controversial to celebrate, too fragile to trust. So did it see combat? Some prototypes probably traveled forward. Soldiers will try anything if it promises an advantage. The Pacific War is full of unofficial modifications. Cut-down blades, homemade grips, improvised scabbards. But effectiveness is proven by adoption. And adoption is proven by production. Australia's real post-war bayonet trail is visible. Owen bayonets in service through World War II, Korea, and early Vietnam, per the AWM summary. That is institutional endorsement. That is a weapon that earned logistics. The sawback hybrid did not. What replaced the idea? It isn't that Australia stopped needing cutting tools. It's that the cutting tool became its own category. Machetes, parang-style blades, fighting knives, and purpose-built implements that don't pretend to be a saw. And that's the key combat lesson. In the jungle, the best equipment is rarely clever. It is dependable. A sawback bayonet is clever. It is also loud, fragile at the worst point, and politically ugly. In close country, those are unacceptable traits. So the combat effectiveness section for this weapon ends with a negative, and that negative is decisive. It didn't change outcomes because it didn't survive long enough to become doctrine. The strategic impact of a failed weapon is still real, because failure teaches faster than success. Australia's broader doctrine in the Pacific shifts toward practical, environment-driven equipment decisions. If a concept cannot survive mud and misuse, it doesn't matter how elegant it looks in a trial photograph. The sawback bayonet idea also collides with a strategic reality. Australia fights alongside allies. Equipment must be interoperable, supportable, and politically defensible. A toothed bayonet is an unnecessary complication when the bigger war demands reliable rifles, reliable SMGs, and reliable supply. Australia's strategic solution is visible in its manufacturing and adaptation patterns. World Bayonets describes the industrial move, Lithgow to Orange, and the revival of bayonet production to meet wartime needs. That is national mobilization. In that context, a fragile experimental hybrid is not worth production line disruption. So the impact becomes indirect. It reinforces the preference for shorter, sturdier blades, like the Owen bayonet format. It discourages features that create structural weakness or logistics headaches. It demonstrates that jungle war is won by tools that keep working after being abused by frightened, exhausted men. Strategically, that's a doctrine shift, from parade ground tradition to operational pragmatism. And it's the kind of shift Australia gets very, very good at. Production and service life. 4 mass-issued weapons. Production is a story of numbers. For this experimental sawback bayonet concept, production is a story of scarcity. We can't responsibly claim a precise production total for a Mk7 knife-saw hybrid without a surviving factory ledger in the public domain. What we can say, anchored in evidence, is how Australia's bayonet production infrastructure worked and what did receive long service. Lithgow began bayonet production in 1913, stopped in 1927, resumed in late 1940, and moved much World War II output to SAF No. 3, Orange in July 1942. The Owen bayonet program shows both wartime manufacture and post-war continuation. The AWM lists an Owen Mk1 bayonet made at Lithgow in 1953, and explicitly notes issue during World War II, Korea, and early Vietnam. That contrast is the production story in miniature. A successful Australian bayonet is one that earned decades of service. An experimental sawback hybrid is one that disappears, sometimes literally heading for destruction, as with the experimental Owen bayonet consignment the AWM describes. As for surviving examples today, institutional collections are the best guideposts. The AWM holdings are your anchor references for Australian experimental bayonet culture and surviving artifacts. Experimental Owen SMG bayonet. Owen Mk1 bayonet and scabbard. Collector value for rare experimental patterns tends to be high, but varies wildly with provenance, markings, and authenticity risk. Anything sawback also attracts reproductions and modifications, so documentation matters more than the steel. The legacy of the experimental sawback bayonet is not that it changed the battlefield. It's that it clarified what Australian soldiers actually needed. Australia's bayonet evolution trends toward compact, functional designs suited to modern rifles and SMGs, tools that can be carried, maintained, and trusted. The Owen bayonet lineage exemplifies that, a purpose-fit knife bayonet that stayed in service across multiple conflicts, documented by the Australian War Memorial. And the deeper lesson is doctrinal, not technical. A bayonet that tries to be a saw risks becoming neither. A soldier already carries enough compromise: ammo weight, water weight, radio batteries, wet clothing, fatigue. If a multi-roll blade compromises structural integrity, it is not a clever solution. It's a liability. In museums, experimental pieces often look like quirky footnotes. In real war, they are brutally simple verdicts rendered in mud: keep it or throw it away. Australia kept the designs that matched the environment. It discarded the ones that didn't. And that is exactly how a small industrial power fights a big war, by selecting practicality over pride, even when the proud idea looks impressive in steel. A strip of steel. A set of teeth. A promise that sounded right. This was the weapon that tried to cut jungle like a saw, tried to fight like a bayonet, tried to serve like a tool: 3 rolls, 1 blade, no forgiveness. In theory, it offered more than the field. It offered noise, snagging, and doubt. The Japanese had bayonets built to work as knives. The Allies had patterns built for reach and drill. Australia tried to weld the two worlds together. And for one brief, uncomfortable moment, somewhere in the wet green dark, it almost made sense. Until it didn't. Back on that Bayonet track, the jungle heard the teeth scream. And it answered.